everybody on our Friday webinar series. In this Friday webinar series, as the name of EGROW goes, we intend to invite the best minds in the world on policy issues. As we all know that EGROW Foundation has been built on the thought that we do research-based policy recommendations, and therefore we are always looking for policy-oriented best minds. It is in that series that we have today Prakash Lonjani from the IMF joining us. Me and Prakash go a long way back, and I know, of course, Dr. Virmani, our chairman. Prakash goes much before that. Now, Prakash has been doing lots of good research at the IMF. He's been in various departments of the IMF, and right now he is at the Independent Evaluation Office. One thing important about what Prakash has been doing all these years is, in his focus, somewhere India has always been there. So therefore, we were for a long time thinking of getting him over and speak to our audience in India. And today he's speaking about the inequalities. Are they welcome or they worrisome? This comes from a paper which he has done. And when we put the recording on our website tomorrow, we will give the link to that paper also. As is the practice, the session, today's session is chaired by our chairman of EGROW Foundation, Dr. Arvind Virmani. And so I hand it over to him now, the session. And I think Prakash has a PowerPoint which he will run. And over to Dr. Virmani, please.
So, yeah, I mean, I would add that when I was the ED in the IMF, I think he and 2 or 3 others were the great researchers I used to talk to when I was there, when I wanted to find out some technical issues in the bank. So it's my pleasure to welcome him to speak to us. With that, please, I guess you checked out how to do please go ahead, Prakash.
Okay, are people able to see my slides? Yeah, okay. So thanks very much, Dr. Virmani. Thanks, Charan, for this invitation. I've been aware of this webinar series, and I've seen it go from strength to strength. So I'm very honored to be invited to speak in it. My talk, as was indicated, is about inequality in India. Is it welcome or worrisome? And my answer is going to be yes. Namely, I will be the two-handed economist and give you a little bit of welcome and a little bit of worrisome. And I hope we can have a bit of a discussion of your views, because I do not come to India as often as I ought to, and I don't stay in touch with India as much as I should, and I would welcome people's views on this work. My talk today will be based on 2 things. One is a book that I wrote last year with Jonathan Ostry and Andy Berg on confronting inequality, which just this year is now available in India from Amazon. And then I will also talk about a forthcoming IMF working paper that was done jointly with Sriram Balasubramaniam, who's a colleague of mine at the Independent Evaluation Office, and Rishabh Kumar, who is at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So I will start out fairly broadly, not talking about India specifically, but about how my views on inequality have sort of evolved over time. I think that mirrors to some extent how views in the profession as well as in policy circles have also changed over time. So I hope this is a useful perspective. This draws on my book. So just to give you a summary of this first part of the talk, I will go through quickly a range of views about whether or not one should worry about inequality. I'll talk about three different views: Surjit Bhalla, Ashok Mitra, and Montek. And my book sort of champions the cause of inclusive growth, and I will try to make a pitch for why we do so. And then I will conclude by talking a little bit about how, at least in the West, in US, UK, the circles I kind of follow more regularly, there has been at least a change in the rhetoric after COVID-19. There has been much more of an embrace of inclusive growth. I will go through this fairly quickly and then come to my paper specifically on India. So one view you might think about is what you might call trickle-down economics, where you just focus on promoting growth and you hope that the growth will reduce poverty, and you don't really worry about inequality. You say, well, that's something that will happen in a dynamic economy. So what? Let it happen. Okay, as long as poverty is being reduced and there's growth, we've succeeded. So Surjit Bhalla, when I interviewed him nearly 20 years ago, sort of expressed this view fairly clearly. And he said that without growth, we will not get anywhere with the other two, namely poverty and inequality. And he said, if you try to reduce inequality without growth, you will simply be cutting the pie into thinner and thinner slices. And he basically said, as it says in the quote below his picture, if I'm right, growth is sufficient, end of story. Okay. And as far as I know, Surjit has not changed his view. In fact, 2 weeks ago, he was telling me, why are you doing all this inequality nonsense? Let's work together on something important like inflation. So this is one view, that worry about growth, make sure it's reducing poverty, and forget about inequality. You might also think that there are some people who feel very strongly about poverty and inequality and are actually advocating a bit of trickle-up economics. They're saying solve the bottom line problems, which are poverty and inequality, and give up this growth fetish. Let growth be whatever it will be. You will have solved the problems that matter, namely poverty and inequality. So Ashok Mitra sort of expressed this view in the 1970s. He wrote a famous piece in EPW saying, get rid of these growth fetishes and go for what really matters, which is poverty reduction. The third view is associated with Montek, which is let's go for inclusive growth, where you talk about fairly rich and complex interactions between growth and poverty reduction, and also between growth and equity. And Montek, also in a famous piece called Inclusive Growth, What Does It Mean?, said that he had thought himself that, let's just have 8-10% growth and everything will be fine, but realized that if it doesn't really reduce poverty, it's not really worth having 8 or 10. And he also said that the growth process should not be increasing inequality too much. There should not be excessive inequality. And that's a theme that we pick up in the book about what are the consequences of excessive inequality. So one of the consequences we stress is that when you have sort of excessive inequality, then it becomes difficult to sustain growth for long periods of time. So this is just a simple relationship you're looking at, where each country, each dot is a specific country. And on one axis, you're looking at how much inequality there was in the country as measured by the Gini coefficient. And on the y-axis, you're looking at how many years they were able to sustain a growth spell. And you can see that there is a negative relationship, meaning that once inequality gets extremely high, then it becomes difficult to sustain growth spells. And we talk about mechanisms through which that can happen, namely, at very high levels of inequality, there is a substantial fraction of your society that is feeling disconnected from the process of growth and improvement in living standards. they feel disenfranchised. There is more lack of social cohesion. It becomes difficult when a country faces adverse shocks to say we are all in this together, let's pull together and get out of it. So it becomes very difficult to sustain growth spells under these circumstances. We also stress that when you look at the factors that determine how long growth spells can be sustained, it turns out that income distribution shows up close to the top of the determinants. So the other determinants there that I have listed are everything that we think are motherhood and apple pie, trade openness, having good political institutions, attracting FDI, having a competitive exchange rate, keeping your external debt low. We have stressed these in all our work. The surprising thing is that when you do a serious analysis of what really sustains growth, it turns out that income distribution ends up as one of the most important determinants, namely having an equitable income distribution. So both at the World Bank and at the IMF, Jonathan Ostry, Ratna Sahai, who I think is in this audience, and many others have been pushing the cause of inclusion at the IMF, financial inclusion, and inclusion of through having equal opportunities for women, etc. And to conclude, I think that after COVID-19, we are seeing quite a remarkable change, at least in the rhetoric that we are seeing in the West. So even a newspaper like the Financial Times, after COVID hit, said that recent developments shine a glaring light on existing inequalities. They say the prevailing direction of the last 4 decades will need to be reversed. Redistribution will have to be on the agenda, and we should be talking about income, basic income, as well as wealth taxes. This is quite a switch from 2017 when they criticized the IMF for worrying too much about inequality and said that the IMF should stick to its knitting. And again, if you look at what billionaires are saying in the West, they are saying you should do the right thing. Inequality is a national emergency. The CEO of JP Morgan is saying that pandemic is a wake-up call to work for the common good. So at least in the West, the rhetoric is changing, and I would be curious to the Q&A to hear about what the rhetoric is in India and what is the feeling about how much to worry about inequality. So with that introduction, very broad introduction about why, at least in my own views, I have changed. In 2002, my views were very aligned with the views that I assigned to Surjit in that interview. But over time, I have become more convinced of the need for taking care of excessive inequality, of being a little more inclusive in the kind of growth that we bring about. So with this lens, this is the lens that I bring to the study of equality in India. So the first thing, as you all know, is that the variation in living standards within India is still quite large. This is somewhat old figures. I know Bihar has done well in recent years, but as of 2011-12, per capita income in Bihar was 13% of Delhi, roughly the same gap as between the US and India. Now, if you really have a dynamic society within the country where there is a lot of income mobility, where people can move around freely, what you should have, according to economic theory, is a convergence in personal income across different states. So in the US, you can see that states that were poor, which is shown on the horizontal axis, were the states that experienced very high growth. And you can see that it almost lies along a very nice diagonal. So in the US, at least until about 1990, there was a very strong process of convergence. By contrast, in US states, I mean, in Indian states, up to 2004, we were not seeing this convergence. We are not seeing anything resembling the downward sloping line that I showed you in the previous chart for US states. What you're instead seeing here is that states that were rich in 1970, shown on the horizontal line, also were the states that grew fast between 1970 and 2004. So in the upper right quadrant, you have the states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and so on, which were rich already in 1970 compared to the rest and experienced the fastest growth. So instead of convergence, you were actually seeing divergence. And, again, there's a paper by Paul Cashin and Ratna Sahai that documented these patterns around this time. Now, there are some people who say, look, don't worry about this. It's a race to the top. So Danny Roderick and Arvind Subramaniam said that the disparity between states is both a cause for concern, but also the consequence of a very powerful positive dynamic. So again, this is the worrisome versus welcome theme that you're seeing at play. And what they argued is that the competition among states to improve institutions and policies will actually lead to a race to the top. And so, yes, there is inequality among Indian states. They were writing this paper in 2004, around the same time that the evidence that I showed you for, namely, there was a lot of divergence, but they were saying, don't worry about this. It's going to lead to good things. So we study the extent to which inequality in India is determined by a person's location. So by location, in this case, we mean two things. One, we mean either the state, or within the state, we also break it down by urban and rural. And we use the consumption surveys to study how living standards, so by living standards from now on, I will just mean consumption as measured in these surveys. We try to see how much location matters for determining people's living standards. Our data, unfortunately, ends in 2011-12. All of you will be aware of the controversy with the latest 2017-18 survey, so we have not obviously been able to use it. This gives you the growth incidence curves for different deciles. So on the horizontal axis, we have broken down people according to the consumption decile in which they fall, the poorest on the left and the richest on the right. So from 1 to 10, these are the 10 deciles. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, you're looking at the growth rate of their consumption over the period 1983 to 2011. Okay, so basically we are studying how fast consumption growth was for different strata of the population in India. So first, let's look at the national data, which is the black line in the middle. And what you see is that it's sort of a bit flat until you get to the top deciles. So if you look at the poorest decile, the growth is about somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. And then it actually dips a bit, so that for the middle class, it's actually a little bit less, but probably given measurement error and so on, not a huge difference to make too much of. So I would say it's kind of basically flat until you get to the 8th decile, and then you can see that the consumption growth of the 9th and particularly the 10th decile, the richest people, is, but by 10th, I mean between the 90th and the 100th. Of the richest decile is quite high. So it's about almost 2.5% a year compared to 1.75. So of course, these differences, when cumulated over a long period like this, 30 years, The difference between 1.75 a year and 2.5 a year is quite significant. Now let's look at rural versus urban. The rural, you can see, is the green line, and that again is flat, but now you can see that the rural middle class, the growth is actually less than the rural poor. And again, you see an uptick for the richest decile, even in the rural areas. Now, when you look at the urban, you're seeing something different, namely that the urban poor, the bottom has not done so well, but it is higher as you go up the income decile. It gets progressively larger, so that the top decile in the urban areas has 2.5%. What about the consumption shares of the bottom versus the top deciles? These have remained sort of constant, except perhaps declining a bit in the rural areas for the top 10%. So here you're looking at the share of consumption that is going to the bottom 40 compared to the top 10. So if you look at the rural areas, the share of the top 10 was about 30%, and it has sort of declined a tad. The share of the bottom 40 has remained the same at about 10%. In the urban areas, again, 30% of consumption going to the top 10% and has increased a tad. The bottom remains about the same. Now, these were just descriptions of the data. To study this, these data in a little more detail with a bit of an analytic framework, we apply a model that was used by Branko Milanovic to study differences in income across countries. So what he did was to take the kind of household surveys that I've been showing you for India. He took household surveys for all the countries for which they were available, and he pooled all of them together. And then he said, let me see how much of an individual income, again, this is split at the level of decile, so you have to think in terms of somebody at the average person in that decile. So he said, let me see how much of a person's income I can explain solely on the basis of where they happen to be born and were working at the moment, and in terms of the inequality in that country. And he found that just these essentially dummy variables for countries and for inequality within a country could explain 50% of a person's consumption on average in a given decile. So he coined this the citizenship premium. Namely, if you want to get rich, yes, you can do so by working hard, but it's better to be just lucky. So if you're born in a rich country, sort of regardless of what you do, chances are that you will have high living standards. 50% of your income or your consumption is explained solely by the per capita income of the country. Okay. Now, what we are trying to do is to say, is there a similar location premium? Okay. There can't be a citizenship premium, everyone is a citizen, but is there a location premium within India? So just like Milanovic's question, I mean, is it better to be hardworking, or is it better to just get lucky by being born in a rich state? Now, one key difference, obviously, from the application that Milanovic did was that migration is much easier within a country than it is across countries. So in that sense, it should be that people, through the mechanism of migration, should be able to improve their lot in life. So to be concrete, what we actually do is to estimate the consumption of an individual, I, in state J, using the same variables that Milanovic suggested, except in our case, these are at the state level, and later you will see at the state level segmented further into urban and rural. But for now, we don't segment out the rural-urban areas. So we just regress the consumption of an individual on the per capita GDP of that state. So that is state GDP per capita for state J, and the level of and the measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient for that state. Okay. So what we are after is to say, look, the right-hand side is not something that an individual can control. State per capita income is sort of a given for a given individual. The level of inequality in a state is also a given. So what we are trying to do is exactly as Milanovic was saying, how much of a person's income is governed solely by factors that are exogenous to that person. They just happen to be born, say, in that state, or they are able to migrate to that state, and based on the inequality in that state. Okay. So remember that Milanovic found that about 50% could be explained just by those two variables when you do this exercise cross-country. So keeping that 50% benchmark in mind, what we were curious about is, what does that number look like when you do it for states within India? Is it less than 50, more than 50, and what does that tell us? So here are the answers. As I said, in the first model, we only look at the state level. So when you regress a person's consumption on the GDP per capita, you get a positive coefficient, as you would expect. Okay. In richer states, the average person is consuming more, has higher living standards. And at this level, the Gini coefficient of the state is not significant. And what you find is that you can explain about 20% of a person's income solely by the location, namely solely by the state in which they happen to be born or to which they were able to migrate. If you simply use state dummy variables, then you explain about 25%. Okay. So don't want to make a big deal of this difference. The number you should have in mind is about 20 to 25% compared to Milanovic's 50. 20 to 25% of a given individual's consumption can be explained solely on the basis of the state to which they belong, either by birth or through migration. The second model, we split each state into rural and urban sectors. So now we have the log of GDP per capita, but now you can see that if I just go back for a minute, you can see at the bottom there that the number of observations I have is about a little over 3,000. Here, since I'm doubling it roughly, I have over 6,000 because I'm looking separately at consumption of somebody who's based in urban and rural. So I'm pooling all that information. And now you can see that you get a similar sort of elasticity of a person's consumption with respect to the state GDP. Previously, it was 0.5, now it is 0.4, about the same. And now you're getting a significant positive coefficient of the inequality of the inequality variable. The interpretation of that always, I think, to me is still a bit elusive, but we can come back to that. But what you're seeing now is that, again, you're explaining 20% of a person's consumption level solely by the state and sector, okay? Because right now we are splitting it into both state and sector. So, and if you actually use the state and sector dummies, you can explain 30% of somebody's income solely on this basis. Okay? So we had not gone in with a strong prior of how this number 30% would come out relative to Milanovic's 50%, but it seems that sort of the same mechanisms that he had in mind are operative, namely the luck of being born in a particular state explains quite a bit, in this case 30% of how rich or poor you're going to be in terms of your consumption. So these are the key findings. We do find that there is a location premium or penalty depending on whether you're born in a rich or a poor state. And location alone explains 30% of the variation in living standards. We find that the income elasticity of consumption is positive, namely that consumption levels are higher for an individual if they happen to be in a state where the per capita GDP is higher. And the urban-rural split also delivers a significant and positive elasticity for the inequality in a state, which means that, as I said, this is a kind of somewhat paradoxical finding, perhaps, and it's different from what Milanovic found at the country level. An individual, taking this finding literally, an individual in India can improve living standards by actually moving to a more unequal region. Now, we can sort of dig a little bit into these are my last slides, so I'm leaving ample time for people's questions, which I see have been coming in the chat, and also any other reactions. We dig a little bit into our findings to see what is actually going on at the urban and rural level to deliver these findings. And I think this chart is quite illustrative. It shows the consumption distribution in rural versus urban areas in 2011 and 12. And what you can see is that first, that the rural, the average of the rural distribution is to the left, namely the average person in the rural area is poorer than the average person in the urban, but also that the distribution is more spread out in the urban areas. Okay. So you can see that there's a longer tail in the urban areas on the right. The other thing you can see is that a person who is fairly poor in the rural areas can sort of take a chance and go to the urban areas, and even if they end up kind of in the bottom to middle part of the urban distribution, they are still better off. And the other thing is that I had shown you the growth incidence curves previously for the whole period from 1983 to 2011. When we look more carefully at the more recent subperiod, which could be driving our results from 2004 to 2011, what you see is that the rural poor are actually not doing so well. You can see that the green line is below the urban line, which is the red. So almost at every strata in the lower deciles, in fact, all the way up to the 6th decile, the rural person is doing worse in terms of consumption growth than the urban person. It's only around the 7th decile that it catches up. But then you can see that the richest people, as was the case over the full period, still are enjoying very high growth in consumption. So the urban rich, have consumption growth of 4.5%, as you can see in that chart, whereas the rural rich, or the richest, the top decile, have income growth of 3.5%. Okay. So clearly, there has been a change comparing 1983 to 2003 versus what we are seeing in at least the last decade for which we have this data. Namely that in the poorer areas, lower and middle income deciles are experiencing consumption growth that is much less rapid than their urban counterparts. Around the 7th, 8th, 9th deciles, it's roughly similar, and then the very rich are doing fabulously well in the urban areas and not so, and less so in the rural. So I think this kind of prism, not surprisingly, helps explain what happened in India in the immediate months of the lockdown. Namely, you sort of shut down the urban economy, you forced a return to rural India, but you can see that based on this kind of chart, you can see why these people were not happy to be forced to go back, and it explains, I think, the immediate resumption of migration back to urban India at the end of the lockdown. And unfortunately, as I said, we don't have the data from 2011-12 onwards because of the controversy with the latest survey. And that's particularly unfortunate because this is a period over which direct benefit transfers have grown enormously. And it would be very interesting to see whether the prevalence of these transfers and the growth in these kinds of transfers, how it is, helping or hurting the process of convergence of incomes across states, across urban and rural areas. So let me stop there. I do have lots of slides on the data that we have been putting together on the direct benefit transfers. Let me conclude with our conclusions. I started off with a broad perspective, telling you why, at least in some part of the global literature, people have started to worry a lot about inequality, and how in my book, I describe the kind of evolution of thought and why people's views have changed. And broadly speaking, the feeling is that excessive inequality is harmful to sustained growth. And you have to do something about pockets of inequality where they are excessive so that social cohesion in society is maintained. And income distribution turns out to be a very powerful determinant of the extent of sustained growth, doing almost as well as the motherhood and apple pie things like trade openness and FDI that we always talk about. And then coming specifically to the Indian context with that lens, what we found with this analysis of the consumption survey data is that, in a country where specific circumstances like caste, inheritance, gender still play a big role, we found that 25 to 30% of the variation in living standards is solely due to the location in which you happen to be born or to which you can migrate. As I said, this is a very different context from Milanovich's paper, even though we use that as motivation, because individuals can migrate within countries with much greater ease than they can across countries. And we think that the statistics that we showed you on how the urban-rural distribution of income and consumption is evolving explains why there has been such a vital migration flow in India from rural to urban areas. And it almost seems like the individuals would be willing to give up, say, a more privileged position in the urban areas to move to, in a class sense, a less privileged position in the urban areas because it actually improves their living standards. So thanks again. And let me now stop sharing my screen so that I can hear from you. Hold on.
Thank you, Prakash.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So before I turn it over to questions,
Yeah.
I do want to give especially on the first your talk, give a perspective, because it happened that I have actually also done a lot of work which you have not referred to. Hopefully, in your next talk, you will refer to it. So let me very briefly, and that's basically, the international lessons are very important, but for policy, the history also matters. So I'm going to kind of give you the perspective from my research and and how it shed some light and a different perspective on what you said in the first half. The second, of course, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and discussion, and it's very useful. So we remember the Indian context. For first 30 years, it's Mitra who ruled, not Bhalla, right? So what we had, India was the first country to introduce Garibi Hatao, poverty alleviation, what we call later, in the 1960s under Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and it was due to people like Mitra who emphasized that we should focus on poverty and not growth. And the result was, and that's very important to remember, and that's why the history is very important. When we take these general lessons, we have to be very, very careful. So what is the history? So if we look at the period from 1950 to 1980, India's growth rate was among the worst in the world. It was at the bottom quintile of the international growth. And the poverty increased. If you look at the trend poverty rate using the World Bank data, the poverty rate actually has a trend increase over this period of 30 years. So when we started talking about growth in the 80s, this is the background. So we must remember that, the context. Now, I'm not justifying Bhalla, because, of course, Bhalla also tends to ignore history once he's caught it. He just gets stuck on one part of history. I mean, history, there's also history from 80 to, 2000, and from 2000 to 220, etc. So the point here is not Bhalla. But the point is that when we started looking at it in kind of the mid-2000s, from the Planning Commission, so what was the result of this? We had the biggest welfare programs. And when I re-examined these welfare programs, so we were actually focusing on poverty elimination, but we were not eliminating it, right? So the growth issue became very prominent. But I also found, and this is a paper which is published actually very strangely in the Pakistan Institute of Development Studies, because EPW was giving me grief on it. So I said, to hell with you, the leftists didn't want it. So what I showed there was that the three largest welfare programs, which the central ones, not even looking at all the state programs, that money was enough to eliminate poverty. That is, if you gave that money and you had a little bit to spare for efficiency and targeting, to every person below the poverty line of that date, you could eliminate poverty. There would be no need to alleviate it. So that was one point which is very important to remember. The further research which I did actually is also there. There is an EPW paper where I showed that the share of consumption of the bottom 43% of the population is a positive. It's an important positive factor in growth. Okay, so this was an interstate analysis where I did a difference equation and showed that cross-state differentials in the bottom 40%. I tried all the other measures also in the share of consumption, but the 40% was the most significant. Okay, so in that sense, it's consistent with what you have said. And the policy implication I drew from that was that welfare programs should be focused on the bottom 40%. Okay, because you get both. You get poverty elimination and you get higher growth. The third result, which is relevant, and I make 4 points. The fourth one brings us to the current situation. The other thing which I found was during that period. So basically, just for your interest, technically, I used both the 2004-5 NSS data and 2011-12. So I did the differences, and the thing was based on those differences. So the third result, which I think is relevant and also is kind of consistent with what you're saying. So it's not that I'm contradicting what you said in your first part, but I'm just advising people who hear, they have to be very careful, So the third result was that poverty, that till that time, even though the share of agriculture in GDP had been going down, the rate of growth of agricultural production did affect poverty. Okay, it was very significant in reduction of overall poverty. Now, of course, we know that the rural, of course, counts. So there's rural issue that agriculture still remained, and this is the migration issue. I think there are some questions which Professor I just vaguely saw. But anyway, so that was the third result. Now, I think the issue, the policy issue we came up with is, if you want to call it inclusive growth, that is fine. The issue was how to reform the welfare system and also promote growth. So the focus on growth, as far as we were concerned, is that there was too little emphasis on growth till 1980 and maybe a little more from 80 to 90. But the whole point of reform was twofold. One, how can you accelerate growth to something level, which is exactly what we did through the reforms and raised it to the top 0.25% from after 80 of quarter decile of the population. And the second one was this UID. So in that same paper on poverty elimination, I proposed a UID to integrate welfare programs. So the issue in India was not that we are not bothered about poverty, not that we are spending all this money and it is hugely inefficient. That's the basic policy point I want to make, which doesn't come out from your overall review. And people can be misled into thinking that the solution which they are proposing in DCs are relevant to India. It's not that we don't spend money on poverty, that we don't care. We were the earliest to care. We've continued to care. The issue here is how to get the money in the hands of the people who need it. So again, we got studies done in the Planning Commission, which very roughly, I mean, it's a very approximate thing. That was the first study which I got done from, I think it was ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, which showed that roughly 1/3 rule, 1/3 of it was wasted in administrative inefficiency, 1/3 in corruption. So the policy implication of that was that if we had a UID-linked welfare system, the first step which I proposed was some kind of a smart card where, because there was huge opposition from leftists, remember, that's the key, the political economy now, huge opposition from the lefties who wouldn't even publish that paper. I couldn't give a talk. My talk in the Planning Commission was cancelled. So the political economy also comes in. That huge resistance from the, I don't know, call it the poverty mafia, if you will, both in the EPW and in the Planning Commission. But let me cut that short. It's not supposed to be a talk by me, but I think it's relevant to your conclusion. So the smart card and then the direct cash transfer, really. So that was the idea, to have a UID which is connected to all the existing welfare programs, and then we kind of combine it into a smart card, because people like the French Indian famous anti-poverty person, the famous French economist son,
Jean Drèze.
Jean Drèze actually liked the overall idea, but he insisted there must be separate things for each element, not have one direct cash transfer. So I proposed a smart card where some of his problems could be addressed. That, okay, we'll have a separate one for food, we'll have but it'll all be in the same card. That food, you want a separate allocation for education, etc. But at least some of these other welfare programs, which were basically somehow trying to get cash into the hands, would all be integrated. And then the direct cash transfer scheme. So the reason which I'm sorry I used up so much time, but when people talk of basic income from the West, I have a negative reaction to it, because we are just trying to come from a historical and a debate which is very different in the US. We have a whole history of trying to reform the system and move. I think that's what we need to do. We need to move this whole system still. And we have been talking about it and still urging the government to call it DBT, call it DCT, direct cash transfer. But that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's the way to go. And it's the pandemic. You mentioned the pandemic. The pandemic actually has brought up is highlighted its importance even more. Because if you had the DCT system that I have been recommending, the migrant would have had direct cash transfers into his mobile. I've been pushing the mobile for the last 10 years that give the money right into his hand. So you didn't have to follow him everywhere. It wouldn't matter if his wife was in the rural areas and he was this, they would all separately get that cash transfer in their own hand. So with that, let me leave the thing. The two important points, as I said, history is important, both for the kind of solutions which are efficient and feasible, and also for the political economy. That's the main point I would make. So with that, let me open it up to questions and comments. I did see, I think, some of the things on the chat, but anyway, yeah. So Charan, is somebody, yeah. Sorry, you want to comment?
No, I just want to say, I mean, I agree with your perspective. I was not suggesting that, I was not advocating either Ashok Mitra or Surjit Bhalla. I'm actually in the middle with inclusive growth. So, and I agree with you that, I mean, I left India in 1979, so I quite know the growth, the stagnation of that time, and so I'm not advocating that. And I actually, my co-author Sriram Balasubramaniam is also on this call, and I think he also has been.
To say, yeah.
Well, maybe if there are specific questions, he could come in, but he's the one who's been doing the work on these DBTs, and exactly has made this, pushing the same point as you, that if with these transfers, you could actually take care of welfare payments in a very quick and efficient manner. Yeah. And that's what is being discovered actually even in the West. I mean, in Spain, there was a very careful study that in the first month or so after the lockdown, the gap between low-income people and the rich went up about % that month, because the low people were losing jobs and losing income. But with electronic transfers, they were able to take care of that by the next month, because the bank had all the data. The bank was seeing that these guys deposit their paychecks in that bank. The bank had all the information to see whose money was not coming in that month, and the state was giving cash transfers through the banks. And within a month, they were able to start making these remedies. So I completely agree that this is really the way to bring the welfare state up to date and actually more effective. Just a couple of, go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I just was looking at the questions in the chat. I think one question was.
Yeah, to come. If your co-author, I would refer him to this 2009 paper, which I think is also on my website, and my committee report. The UID, we didn't just propose it; we actually carried through, and I chaired the committee which gave the final recommendations. So this was a well thought out approach, which then got called Aadhaar and has not reached its completion. That's one point. Second point related to yours, which he should take note of, is the cash transfer through we have. It's fine for urban areas, but for this migrant issue and rural areas, the mobile wallet is critical. And it's simple. You know what? In demonetization, I heard reports of people who had actually gone back, for example, they said they had to take a one-day trip to get the money from their account. Okay, so we have correspondents, we have banking correspondent, but there's nothing comparable to a mobile wallet where you immediately get the money. And of course, this duality where the husband and wife are separate is also addressed seamlessly, because all you need to do is have the UIDs, have it in your database. That's the key. Okay? And it's huge empowerment. It's absolutely, it's unimaginable. People who have not dealt with the poor can't imagine what empowerment is. I went so far as to suggest that if necessary, women have less mobiles for various. I said that give it free. There's some as part of your welfare, just give them free, all women. Okay, so huge empowerment student, and I hope you're further. If you already noted the question, you want to start answering them, or should we?
I'll just take a quick pass. I think there was one question about why the urban lower decile is the consumption growth was even lower than the rural. I think I answered that later, because the first graph that I showed was for the period 1983 to 2011. And indeed, when you break it down, as I showed later, into 2004 to 2011, then that particular pattern goes away. It was, it was a product of the earlier period, but doesn't hold from 2004 to 2011. One question is, does the urban bottom decile consist mostly of migrants? That's something that I know we have also thought about. I don't know if our data quite allows us to identify that, but that's clearly something that would be good to track down. Do we use all the states or only the major ones? I think we use all the states in the cross-state regression. If the implied question is that it would be good to retest it only using the major ones, I agree. I think that's probably a good idea. Ashima Goyal has a comment that the fact that the migration does not reduce inequality has to do with the failure of India's failure to create high productivity manufacturing jobs. Okay, I think people would agree with that. I think that's a good point. And then there was a question also, somebody, I guess Manoj, saying that he has a paper with Bhaskar that estimating the generalized Lorenz curve, and finds that there was gain at the national level, but does not hold for all states. So that's very good. That's sort of what we would expect also if we did it with our data. And I think all of you are saying that DBT is the way to go, and I think that indeed is something. I don't know if, let me give the floor to Sriram for a minute if you want to add something, Sriram.
Thanks, Prakash. That was a very good presentation. Just a couple of points. I agree with Dr. Virbani on many of his points. On the urban factor, I think one of the interpretations that we can make is that urban inequality is actually driving the overall inequality more, at least from our results. But I definitely agree that DBT is perhaps the most transformative, instrument or in probably Indian history, because it has had such a substantive impact, especially at the lower deciles. Even I can go at least from our initial interpretations. If you look at the leaked NSSO data of 2017-18, if you look at the lower decile growth, the lower deciles have the highest consumption growth, even within that data. Because I think the advantage of DBT is, like what Dr. Virmani said, it's very targeted, it's highly efficient if it's done well, properly, and it covers large sections of the poor. So I think we have some preliminary analysis on that, and we hope to update some of this work with that as well. So yeah, these are probably the few points I want to add.
I see there were some more comments from Ashima. Ashima,
Yeah.
do you want to come in?
Ashima, you want to comment or question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, very nice presentation, Prakash. And this is
Thanks, Ashima.
and I really liked Dr. Virmani's comments also. India's history and our struggle with the welfare schemes. So I think DBT is excellent, and we have really saved a lot of leakages implementing that. Already, I think the government is large saving, so it's not at all, it needs to grow much more. But I think another factor is that because of the path of public intervention in industry, the public sector, and government was focused on that. So the provision of public goods, health, nutrition, education, etc., really suffered in India. Environment, and we know that the rich are able to put inverters for electricity failing, have private schools, compensate. The poor cannot. So in terms of productivity, jobs, and improvement in this provision is very, very important for reducing inequality. Apart from just direct transfers, I think the debate should not focus, that is for the really poor, the persistently poor, but the empowerment of the, those who can be mobile. Public good provision is really important.
Yeah. Well, Prakash, I don't know whether you want to respond, but yeah. So, this is something, again, as in the Planning Commission. In fact, again, there's a Planning Commission paper that public and quasi-public goods, there has to be a focus. The problem is all this diffuse just to give you a number, the last time I looked at it at the district level, there were 250 to 350 different programs. A district collector at the in the district, he's the main chap. He had to supervise 250 different programs. That was the motivation from which I came on this whole simplification, UID, etc. So that was one aspect. The other is, like Ashima quite rightly pointed, drew our attention that by definition, if public good and quasi-public goods like basic education and public health are not provided, the poor, in a sense, lose out. So the basic approach which we outlined was twofold. One is government should focus on these public and quasi-public goods, and secondly, it should eliminate or reduce all these programs and collapse them into one cash transfer. So that's really the framework. So thank you, Ashima, for reminding us. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all from my side. There were a couple of technical questions which we will just respond to bilaterally about the paper.
Okay, Charan, did you see any questions, or were there any?
I think this.
I have one technical issue. Can I come in?
Boliye, yeah, Doctor.
Professor Longwani, it's very interesting presentation, and your Milona analysis extending to India is quite interesting. Actually, you almost find a elephant cloud, but there is one small issue there.
Right.
With the regressions.
Yeah.
The fact that the consumption is very important, I mean, it is influenced by where you are located is fair enough, but your 20% and 30%, these numbers are slightly problematic because, you are going by the R-square value, and in both the regression, your constant term is significant, which means not only the independent variables that you include, but the excluded variables also contribute to the R-square value. So I think that 20%, 30% thing is slightly problematic.
No, that's a good point. We'll look at what the case was for Milanovic. So maybe we just need to kind of scale back accordingly. I think perhaps even in his case.
Otherwise, very nice.
No, that's a good point. We'll, because we are throwing around these numbers, we'll make sure that we are interpreting them correctly. Thank you.
Professor Swami, you want to ask your question? Professor Swami?
Sir, am I audible? Sir, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Sir, it was a good presentation, Prakash sir. Just my question is, when I was following your presentation, I noticed that the deciles, when you are showing the growth of deciles, I think 7th, 8th, and 9th were almost equal for both rural as well as the urban. But only there was a sharp jump towards upside in the case of urban. So should we now conclude that only the top decile, that is the topmost decile, the rich, the top 10% rich, they are only making the huge difference in terms of consumption in India? Because 7th, 8th, and 9th are almost equal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we just presented the numbers the way they came out. I mean, I don't know that I have a good enough understanding of the evolution of consumption in India to know whether that passes the sniff test. But yeah, I think literally I was surprised too to see how identical those consumption growth was for those 7th, 8th, and 9th deciles, and then it's only at the very top that you see a divergence. Yeah, I think taken literally, it says it's getting more concentrated at the very richest. I don't know if Shriram has a better view of that.
Sir, I have one corollary question for that. When you are showing the difference between urban and rural, for the rural you took 40%, something like that, and for the urban you took the top 10%.
Correct.
What was the rationale behind that kind of a decision to compare the 40% for the rural and then top 10%?
I mean, I think that's kind of a common split that people show in this literature. You know, for top, you generally show top 1, 5, or 10%, and then the bottom 40. You know, the World Bank has an official kind of shared prosperity metric where they look at the bottom 40 and compare it to the top. So there's no particular justification.
No, there should be some rationale. Why the 40%? That I wanted to know. What is that rationale behind picking only the 40%?
I don't know that there is a particular cutoff. I think that, you know.
Well, Prakash, you can use my EPW paper. My friend Kaushik has used it also. It shows the importance of 40% for India.
Oh, it does. I see.
Yeah,
okay.
That's what I'm saying. I showed that the bottom 40% share of consumption had a strong effect on growth.
Oh, so you had considered different cutoffs, and you found 40 was where the action was.
40, and it's a difference in difference regression. It's it's as good as you get here in India anyway.
Okay.
It's a common paper.
Split. You know, in the World Bank's definition of shared prosperity, I think they say something like raising the share.
Kaushik used it after he read my paper. He started using the 40%.
Okay.
Yeah. Though I'm not sure. In the beginning, he attributed it to me, but since then, probably has forgotten.
Professor Subramaniam, the former RBI GM, I think he also has a question. Do you want to go ahead now?
Good evening, Doctor. Good evening, everybody. And it's been excellent presentation. Thanks for EGROW Foundation, Dr. Virmani and Dr. Charan Singh. And here, I have been in Reserve Bank of India dealing with poverty alleviation programs across from late 70s, right through 2005. And then I have been later involved with the financial management assessment study for the World Bank program to assist Government of India and Dr. Vaidyanathan Committee recommendation, cooperative banking sector reforms. That is 15,000 crores was to be assisted. That study I was involved across the country in India. I found several IRDP and PMRY studies. I was directly connected. I had conducted studies, and including IRDP cash programs, cash transfer programs. What I found was, what we found generally, it has been a direct study from the field. Most of the time, the infrastructure facilities were not available at the rural areas. That is in health and all other things. So whatever was given, whether you give 5,000 rupees or 50,000 rupees, just goes for pittering away, not for building their own lives. This has happened even at the last mile of connectivity. This I have been involved in African continent as chairman of the African Center for Mobile Financial Inclusion from 2008 to 2011. And I also had seen in Kenya and Nigeria and other countries the same position. There are two things I found was the delivery point. And Dr. Virmani had correctly talked about the political economy. Please, I fully agree with him. But that is the implementation part is only government machinery, irrespective of the political party in power. That does not alter. And in the process, whether the person is a migrant or local person does not matter. He is going to be in a place for his living. So whatever money you transfer, he is going to be frittered away most of the time. And he goes further down. He is not going to improve his position. This has been the very resounding position despite cash transfers, which we have been talking about. SHG programs also, I was involved directly with NABARD. I had inspected the NABARD at the head office after. So I am fully aware what has been happening in the ground. So my feeling is that this cash transfer alone will not help unless until you have a strong implementation machinery, that is Gram Panchayat system. That should work very clearly. We should empower. I feel Rajiv Gandhi brought in, but that had not worked well in India so far. That has not been strengthened. Even recently, this Narendra Modi's program of cash transfer in Tamil Nadu, crores of rupees have been frittered away. You must have seen that bogus accounts have been created and the money has been transferred in every district, every taluk, every panchayat, and they have been recovered back to the banks, and then several government officials have been inquired into. Real criminal action has not been started yet, but that perhaps it may not come to at all. But this is an open position. So in this position, how do you say the poverty alleviation will change and the divide what we talk will narrow, the gap will narrow? What is your suggestion for that?
Well, I think that you're on the ground and much more aware of what's going on. My impression of the DBT schemes was somewhat more favorable than what you have sketched out. I'm not questioning what you have said, but my feeling was that compared to schemes in the past, DBT, in a sense, both had the potential for quick corruption and quick siphoning away of the money, but also the potential for more targeted and more careful transfers. So I don't know what the evidence is on the ground. I trust your what you have described, but as I said, I had a much more favorable view of how DBT was working in terms of the corruption issues being resolved more than they were in the past. But maybe Sriram or Dr. Virmani have some views as well.
Yep. Yeah, Prakash. Just to add to one point. Thanks a lot, Professor Subramanian, for your thoughts. I do agree that the relative levels of corruption. So I think compared to the system that we had earlier and what we have now, the difference is quite stark. And second, like what Dr. Virmani mentioned, there are obviously there are some ways the system can be reformed and refined further through things like the mobile wallet and other ways of improving the scrutiny of these accounts. But at a broad level, my personal view is that it compared to the earlier system, I think the leakages have been trimmed and have been the overall system is much more efficient. Is the sense that I get.
Yeah. So just to complete, the key thing which is missing from our original vision of this is that it was that all welfare program must be seeded by the UID, now called the Aadhaar. So without it, there is still a lot of manipulation across schemes, across, there are people who are not, again, I think it's important, the first time I started thinking about it, I'll tell you, it was at a seminar on food, where I think it was the food secretary from Orissa who said that he couldn't do starvation in Kalanidhi. Okay, shocked, literally. And I said, so this first time I started thinking of, it's not just a matter of corruption, which of course we all keep discussing, were left out. So the UID, I thought of that at least whoever is needy, and as a rough thing you could define as half the population, they must have a UID, because that's the only way to know not only who is getting 2 and 3 times, but those who are not getting anything. And for that, you have to link it all. Otherwise, you can't know. It's impossible, literally impossible to know. So you must know who is being benefited by every scheme. DCT may take time, but without it, you will get this kind of thing, both errors. But yes, I think, I'm sure your work will show that DBT has improved, and it's good. We look forward to that. And as I said, I'm not, my suggestions are not as a criticism, but I'm past my research age, and maybe some of these issues you guys can take up now.
Well, I'm also past, but this young man, Sriram, may take it forward.
Yeah, so. Right. Okay, that's great. No, this was a fascinating discussion. I hope the
Doctor, may I intervene?
Yeah, no, I think we are well, it's 6:40. Yeah.
One second for me. The basic thing is the basic facilities of healthcare, education, and the other minimum things which are required for a minimum living in the remote corner of a village is not ensured. Your cash transfer will not help improve the divide.
I think, we have to now end. We are 15 minutes past the time. But as I said, thank you to Prakash and also Sriram and who have participated. Thank you. Charan, do you want to conclude somehow? Charan?
Yeah, this was an excellent interaction, both technical and policy oriented. And I would like to thank each one of you, Prakash, and your co-author, and of course our chairman, Dr. Virmani, who is on top of it. Now, I have an announcement to make. Next week, as you know, we work on policy issues. We have Rashmi Bhaskaran, who's our expert at EGROW, talking to us about a new education policy and the financing of the education to the extent of what percentage of GDP, and she's going to give us all these details. And there is going to be a panel who's going to be discussing the new education policy and education per se in terms of India's, in terms of GDP and its contribution. So requesting everybody to be around again, same time, next Friday in continuation of our Friday EGROW webinar series. So let me then just conclude by saying, Prakash, I know it's very early up there. Thanks for having joined us and given us this excellent presentation. It'll be up and running on our website tomorrow by noon. The PowerPoint which you have made will also be there. Everybody can share it wherever we wish to. Because this is such an interesting policy-oriented discussion, I intend to send it to the ministry as well as NITI. So with this, thanks to all of you.
Thanks very much, Charan. Thanks, Arun. Good to see you. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.